College football nerds here talking a little bit about the Michigan Spygate situation. I got Nerd Josh here with me, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what came out today with some of the on the field video stuff and just in general talk about sign stealing. Going to have a little disclaimer at the beginning that's largely aimed at Michigan fans. So y'all hang on with us before you get down in the comments and get angry. I want to remind y'all, collegefootballnerds.com is a huge project for us. Got our model out there. We've got relative performance statistics. We've got a pick 'em. We've got a top 25. Later this week, we're going to be posting our first ever model generated 1 through 133 power poll. So y'all go check that out. I think you'll really enjoy it. All right, Josh, there's a few concepts I want to discuss with this situation, but I want to give this disclaimer because we tweeted about it and a couple million people saw it. It got a ton of traction, and we weren't trying to we don't do stuff for clicks. And that's kind of what this disclaimer is about, because Michigan fans are like, y'all hate Michigan or you're just doing this for engagement, whatever. We don't hate Michigan. I can honestly say if this came out for any team, including my favorite team or your favorite team, we would be having this same discussion, because this is not about the team that did it. It's about what happened. And so I don't want, and honestly, this is to our detriment, because we do a lot of things on this show in terms of keeping it real that have really hurt us in terms of traction, but we want to talk about what we want to talk about and not just do stuff to appease people. The best thing we could do for numbers in this video, Josh, would have been to do something sticking up for Michigan, because we wouldn't have lost anybody else and we would have gained a lot of Michigan people. So I want to put that out there. We're doing this to our own detriment, but it's an important conversation. So Josh, I want to start off in general with just kind of setting the scene on what we talked about today, what kind of broke today that's made this a little more serious than normal accusations, and then we can get into some of the details.
I think it's important when we start off to really figure out what the facts are, because there's a lot of discussion going back and forth. We've got that tweet. That tweet got a lot of traction. That traction brought a lot of, let's say, casuals, to borrow from our friend, other Josh. And a lot of people don't really understand what the situation is in full. And understanding the situation, I think, is really important to understand what the significance is of everything that's going on right now. So there's an analyst named Stalions at Michigan that has been accused of scouting opponents off-site at their games. Now, there's a rule in the NCAA that says you can't do advanced in-person scouting. That rule was put in place mainly because teams with limited resources didn't want to be in a position where they had to send scouts to every team on their schedule, and they all had to send scouts because they felt like it was going to be an arms race versus the wealthiest schools. It's always important to remember with things like this, or another whole point would be, why are there no radios in the helmets? These roles all exist because the small schools can't afford them. And people say, as we've pointed out many times, that the NCAA is a billion-dollar industry. Well, first, it's a billion-dollar industry with tens of thousands of employees, so the actual revenue per student is only about $60,000 in the upper conferences. And two, the NCAA doesn't run NCAA sports. It regulates a bunch of independent schools, and a lot of the small schools, in fact almost all of them, lose money as it is. Only the biggest schools make money hand and fist. Everybody else is at a disadvantage. So that's the first part of it, right? There's the breaking the rule of advanced in-person scouting. The additional details that have come out have made it a lot worse. So it's turned out that not only were they doing in-person scouting, but they're sending individuals to go to those games with cell phones, and there's paper records of the tickets being given to these people, and there's actually photographic evidence from some of the Big Ten schools where they have people sitting there in the seat that Stalions has bought recording the opposing sideline. And they're doing that because they want to get signals. Now, some people have said, well, on TV you can get signals, right? On All-22 you can get signals. In the All-22, they don't show the sideline from those angles. They do that intentionally. They're kind of careful about it, especially the home team doesn't want to show their signals. But they keep those camera angles really high, and they're really cut and focused on the field. And plus, you really couldn't see hand motions or anything on those clips anyway. It's not nearly detailed enough at that level. And of course, the camera broadcasts on TV, you can't see anything too much. There is a separate rule in the NCAA rules. It's Article H, Section 11. I may have that backwards. That essentially says you can't use any electronic recording devices or any electronic devices whatsoever in order to record signals. Some people have noted that section is usually, or it exists in the section dealing with what kind of equipment you can have in your stadium. But I note the reason of that is you're not allowed to advance scout on opposing stadiums in the first place. So, of course, it's not addressed to that because it was already illegal. So there's really two different rules that have been violated. So now we've gone from advanced scouting to sign stealing. So now we're in the New England Patriots Astros territory. And where it gets more towards the Astros sort of territory is that there are video clips that came out today, and that's what we tweeted about, that show this analyst Stalions standing next to the defensive coordinator at the Ohio State game on the first drive of the game, clearly squatting down, looking at the opposing sideline, turning to the coordinator and saying something to them, and everybody starts pointing pass. First drive of the game. There's no way they've had time to figure out signs at that point in the game. And so the only conclusion you can have is that, yes, they have been recording signals. They're reviewing those recordings, using that to there's two parts to signals, right? There's the actual hand motion, and there's the scheme of signaling. They're decoding both of those, undoubtedly. And they're using that to tell the coaches live and in-game. So this wasn't a rogue agent. He's working in partnership with at least the defensive coordinator at Michigan. So this becomes a much more serious issue than just a guy doing advanced scouting. It's a pretty significant, again, Houston Astros level accusation that's now more or less verified.
And look, there's a couple of refrains that we keep seeing from Michigan fans, and I want to say this now. If this was Ohio State being charged with this, Michigan fans would absolutely not be defending them by the millions. It's just because it's their team, and I get it. That's human nature. You know, we all have the pull to do that. But look, to your point, in the first drive, they immediately, the entire team is pointing pass. The entire team knew what was going on. Just because Ohio State scored on that drive does not mean they weren't cheating, right? Like, if I drove my car 150 miles an hour and didn't die, that doesn't mean I didn't drive recklessly. You broke the rule. The rule exists. Whether you ultimately won the game or not, it doesn't matter. You broke the rule. But also, for everybody to be doing those hand signals immediately and have such confidence in acting on them, you know, there was also some news that came out that Ohio State suspected that some of this might be going on, so they changed up their signals a little bit. That if you're advanced scouting, you might know first, second, third set of signals, third order of signals. And if the other team isn't doing this level of advanced scouting because it's illegal, then they may not think to have some crazy matrix of signals to indicate to get around what you might be doing cheating. But also, to your point about people saying, well, you can just get this from the All-22, you can just get this from the TV broadcast. If that's the case, why are you sending an analyst? If you can get all of this from TV, if you can get all of this from an All-22 or whatever film the two teams share before the games, why are you sending an analyst at all? Because that's undeniably sketchy. Just at its best, that's sketchy, which tells me you're doing something to gain a competitive advantage. And Josh, this is where it all comes back for me. And I want to say as an aside, the rules about advanced scouting were put in place in the 80s when everybody huddled. It's even more prevalent today because of obviously all the play cards and everything from the sidelines. But this was something they didn't want you doing back in the day when you couldn't know what play was being called based on what was coming from the sidelines. So that's worth noting. But all of this, Josh, to me, is a non-football competitive advantage, and that's why I hate it. And this is where I really want to kind of lean into this discussion a little bit. It's skirting the rules in an attempt to not block and tackle better, to not scheme better. If you look at that video where all those coaches are during so Ohio State looks at the sideline to see what the coaches are putting in terms of play. So there's a break in the action. It's like 10, 15 seconds, which is a pretty long break because the play clock's running. Everybody on the Ohio State sideline is coaching. Everybody on the Michigan sideline is cheating because they're not coaching. They're not trying to react to they're not even looking at the players on the field or seeing if they're doing wide splits or if they're lining up with, two tight ends or anything like that. They've got their personnel on the field, and they're waiting to see what Ohio State does. That's not football. That's not coaching. You are not doing something based on what you've coached and installed for your team, you're just waiting to react and cheat based on what the other team is doing. That's not, to me, that is gaining a competitive advantage, not based on how good you are, not based on how well you recruit. To me, it just, if nothing else, even if it doesn't come out that there's this big violation and they get put on probation or whatever, it's such a violation of the spirit of the game. That's what really I have a hard time getting past on this one.
My take on this, to a large extent, comes down to the fact that you've got to draw a line somewhere for what you just feel to be wholly unacceptable. And football's a game, okay? And it has rules to make the game competitive and fair and to work. I think sometimes we get in this weird mindset of thinking that football is this immortal thing that exists in its own fabric, but it's a set of rules somebody made up a long time ago. And the rules have been refined to the way they are because it makes the game fun and makes it competitive. You can't hold an offensive receiver going downfield, right? You can't clip. You can't do a lot of things. These are another sets of rules because if I have the ability to read your signs and to look at how your signaling plays in, and let's be clear, it's one thing to know 2 or 3 plays, right? If you watch a TV broadcast, you can probably get some signals if you were to really try to break that down, and I know coaches have done that. If you're watching every signal, you can figure out the whole scheme. Again, there's a difference between the, hey, shift right, this, maybe you're on offense and you do this and it means, okay, you're going to switch to the deep route, right? And the much more complicated signals, which are the actual play, alignment, shift kind of things, it's almost impossible to play football if they know what play you're running every time, right? There's a reason these rules exist. And in that vein, if you accept the fact that we don't want them to know everything you're doing, you accept the fact that if you record digitally, you can decode the signals. I'll tell you, when I was probably not going to shock you guys, but I was like 8 years old playing a game in Pee Wee football, I decoded the other side's signals on offense. And at that time, I felt guilty doing it live. But it's not that hard for people to decode signals. And if you take somebody like me or Daniel and you give me tape in enough time and let me sit in an office, much less this guy that used to be in the military, yeah, we're going to decode all the signals. So now I'm going to know every play. That's the end result. I think it breaks things. And where along the line do you want to stop that, right? Because, okay, maybe you say, well, you should just change up your signals. All right, well, is electronically recording signals all that different from putting a microphone in the booth for the opposing coaches during the game and I'm listening to the calls they're making? Either way, I know the signals they're putting in. I know the play call as it's put in. What is the difference between me stealing their signals illegally and putting a microphone in the booth to listen to everything they're saying illegally? You just think the only real difference is how egregious you think the conduct itself is, because the result's the same, right? If I tap into their headset to hear all the calls, the result is the same. And that's why the rule that exists in the rule book about stealing signs is you cannot use electronic devices in order to record signals, because the whole point, okay, yeah, live action, you figure out the other team's signals. I've heard players talk about this forever. They're college kids. Some of them are really bright. They can figure out line calls and shifts, whatever. But the moment you're doing it electronically, you've crossed into the line of, I know your plays because I'm cheating using an electronically assistive method, and I'm going to know your plays, and I'm probably going to win, or I'm going to have a huge advantage to be able to win. And that's, to me, that's where this really crossed the line. When I found out that they were actually recording signals, when it became clear that they were calling the signals at the first drive of the game, which means they were recording it, breaking it down, and doing the decoding, they've crossed a serious line. It's the same kind of line the Astros crossed. In many ways, I think it's actually worse here, because at least in a pitcher, you got to stop what's coming. In college football, if you know the play, you can basically blow it up. And look, I get the fact that, yeah, maybe Ohio State changed signals, maybe they didn't. To Daniel's point, I don't think the outcome matters. Whether your cheating stopped them from scoring or not, you still cheated. And even there, maybe Ohio State changed some of their signals to start with, and they thought it was a pass when it was a run. I don't really care about that either. I just care that it's clear they thought they knew the signals. And you know what? It may well be by halftime in that game, whatever they didn't know or whatever was changed, because they knew the scheme, they were able to reverse engineer the last few pieces, and they knew the scheme the second half of that game. Sort of seems shocking. And I'll say one more thing, maybe inflammatory, but it's true before I pass it back to you, Daniel. The whole time I've been hearing this story with Michigan, in the back of my mind, I've been thinking to the fact that Michigan is the team more than any other, maybe LSU, but it was because Ed Orgeron, that has been completely inconsistent with our model and expected results on a continual basis. They have beaten teams that our model has consistently said are much better than them. And there have been years when they performed at a high level and they go into a game and it makes no sense that they don't show up. Be it Ohio State game years ago, but TCU, right?
TCU.
And I can't help but sit here and think, like I said, I've been saying all offseason to a lot of people's chagrin, it makes the most logical sense from a data performance standpoint to say that the Ohio State-Michigan game was really the aberration. And if it turns out they had Ohio State signals the whole game, and that's why they beat the pulp out of them, I mean, that just completely changes my entire perspective on Michigan as a football team. It explains a lot with the model. All of a sudden, those pieces start to make sense in my head, just being the cold-hearted, logical guy I am. But to me, it also just really strikes home how serious this is in my mind and how offensive it is, and why, I don't know if you agree with me, why, to me, anyone that had explicit involvement with this has to be fired, not just punished. Any coaches that did this have completely violated the spirit of the game. They've got to be suspended, and the coaches have got to be let go. I mean, they've cheated at too high of a level, and I mean, it completely destroys the integrity of everything we've watched the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough for me because I know that I'm not so, wide-eyed and innocent that I think that there's not all kinds of cheating going on. But I also think that here's my big issue with it, because people have said, well, everybody steals signs. Clemson did it a while back, which, by the way, I don't love that Clemson did it. And if you notice that once they got called out for cheating, for sign stealing, they fell off the map. Like, they absolutely fell off the map. 2019 Ohio State game that they almost lost, probably should have lost if it wasn't for some bad calls. Next year, blown out by Ohio State. Since then, they've had a 3-loss season every single year. It's a weird correlation. But what I want to say about this is, look, if you're playing any teams that are adhering to the letter of the law and they're not doing advanced scouting, then that's really unfair for them. And so I think there's a lot of let's say there's other Big Ten teams that are doing this and cheating in some way. Some of them aren't, which means the ones that aren't are at a huge disadvantage. It's like playing in the steroid era of baseball and not taking steroids. Like, you're at a huge disadvantage. And that's not fair to those teams at all. So what you're doing is you're preying on one of two things. Either you're preying on the fact that they're not doing it and you're going to have a huge advantage, or everybody knows you're doing it, wink, wink, so they have to spend all this extra time preparing for you, changing signals and doing completely non-football related get around your cheating sort of stuff instead of actually practicing blocking and tackling. That's the other piece of this, is even if everybody knows you're doing it and you don't get punished for it or whatever, you have neutralized any talent, scheme, or coaching or ability gap that a better team might have over you or a team close to you might have, because they've had to spend time working around your cheating. And that really bothers me because, again, we're back to a non-football competitive advantage. And that's why I get frustrated when people are like, well, just tell them to change the signals. How much the NCAA regulates how much practice time you get during a week. So now we're going to spend all this time during the week teaching a whole new set of signals because we're playing Michigan? That's not fair. Let's spend time blocking and tackling. So the other thing, Josh, that I want to point out here is, we keep hearing about they're already under NCAA investigation. And to me, this is where you see maybe a pattern. And it's not about a hamburger. It's about what I think the most serious, and I don't think the NCAA has fully come out and said this, but I think the most serious accusation that's currently being investigated for the Harbaugh stuff, where he initially, offered up the ban or offered up the self-suspension, was violating COVID visitation rules. And that's the same situation where a lot of other people stuck to that rule and didn't go out, and recruit during COVID. And Michigan skirted that rule. and gained a huge competitive advantage because if you're doing it and nobody else is, you got a big advantage.
The term lack of institutional control gets thrown out, and that term doesn't really have the same meaning anymore because they have level 1, level 2 violations, etc. But the problem with all of this is, it becomes really easy to think that Harbaugh thinks himself above the rules, frankly. It's hard to take it any other way. And now it may be that this is about the defensive coordinator at Michigan thinking that he was above the rules, and maybe this was an edge that he was trying to get with their coaches. You never really completely know. Sometimes these coordinators are cheating for their jobs to save it under their head coaches, so maybe it's hard to put it on Harbaugh. But right now the rules have been amended to say it's the head coach's responsibility to know what's going on. I think mainly that was due to basketball and those allegations of cheating, because so many of the offensive coaches or assistant coaches got the boot and got blackballed, and the head coaches managed to insulate themselves from that under the rules. So that's changed. The thing that bothers me the most, though, is when it gets to the point of repeatedly taking advantage of situations, finding out that you're violating the COVID rules, which, agree with it or not, the point of the COVID rules is that it was a safety rule. So everybody needed to abide by it. And to violate...
Well, Josh, that's the thing, right? Like these are the two rules that, like, you may not think it's a big deal, but it's not up to you to think it's a big deal. You just have to stick to the rule.
Right. And everybody else that followed that rule was not recruiting these guys in large periods of time. They had a lot of dead periods. They had a lot of limitations on in-person visits. And yeah, if you get a guy to come to your campus during a COVID dead period or COVID period and go past those contact limits, you're going to have a really substantial advantage on that kid who's now gotten to see you. And he's going to wonder why he doesn't have as good a relationship with anybody else. And at 17 years old, he's probably not going to understand, well, they're not allowed to talk to me, nor is he, but he's actually talked to me. And he's not going to see that as a bad thing. And of course, no one knows to call him out. The whole deal with Reggie Bush years ago, 2 points from that. One, this idea that what Reggie Bush did is legal now, total farce. He took an advance from a sports agent against his future NFL earnings, which is still completely illegal, first off. Second, the problem with USC was that they had agents that were allowed to wander the dorms. They had passes to get into the dorm complexes. They did not know where their Heisman Trophy winning running back lived. They didn't know what car he drove. How do you not know where Reggie Bush lives? How do you not know where Matt Leinart lives? The only way you don't know that is if you know you probably are doing stuff you shouldn't, and you're just trying not to get busted, and you're trying to turn a blind eye. That is why USC got hammered. And the problem I have with Michigan in this situation is, yeah, maybe Clemson was doing the same thing, okay? We don't have the evidence of exactly what Clemson did from a sign-stealing perspective. As far as anyone knows, they did it by just watching TV broadcasts, watching teams live, they had people in the booth, whatever. They may have done it within the rules, because it is possible to take signs within the rules. I think it's probably a little dirty, but it's possible, okay? If we had the same evidence from Clemson, I would be saying the same thing about them.
Absolutely.
You're the ones that got busted doing it. And you got busted red-handed because, frankly, Stalions was an idiot. He's Venmoing people money for the tickets for the games, and it lines up when the guys are there, and he's got like a clover leaf on Venmo that was public when he goes to the Notre Dame game. Or, the Georgia game, he had a peach, I think, that he sent. It was idiotic, but you got busted. And the thing is, it's so easy to skirt these rules and hide it for so long that when you do one of these integrity sort of violations and you get caught, you must get hammered. And yeah, other people may be getting away with it, but the point you have to get across is, don't ever do this. Because if we ever catch you, you're done. Right? Because it's going to be so hard to catch you that we have to put the fear of God into anyone that is ever caught so that nobody else does it.
And look, like, one of my hopes that comes out of this is that if Michigan goes down, they bring everybody down with them that was doing it. If they haven't, and that's just to show that this is not a Michigan thing. I love Michigan football. I'm kind of a blue blood snob in that regard. Like, so again, I just want to hammer this home. This has nothing to do with Michigan or our supposed disdain for Michigan, whatever. I want the truth to come out because I want the people who had to play against teams and it felt like they were just swimming upstream the whole time and everything they were doing was getting blown up. Like, I want them to have some validation in those experiences, because these guys worked their ass off for 4 years, blood, sweat, and tears, and it may be that they lost because they didn't think to cheat in a way somebody else did, and that just burns me up. There's so much going on that is taking away from the integrity of the sport. We don't need the actual teams doing it too. So there's that. But Josh, there's one last thing I want to touch on. And I think, and I told you this earlier today, I think that the whole story will eventually come out, and here's why. There are people on that staff that want to coach football again or more, and they don't want this cloud hanging over their head forever. And so they're going to have interviews with other teams, and they're going to have opportunities to tell the whole story, in that I was compelled by my boss, and if he said if I didn't do this, then I get fired, or we had all of these people at the top that were doing, like, those sorts of things are going to come out. And to me, that's what's going to keep us from not knowing the truth. Like, I do not see a way where we don't find out kind of the whole story, because there's too many people involved, it seems like, to keep it under wraps.
Yeah, I think that's true. And for a lot of these coaches, their reputations are tarnished more than you think, because if you leave Michigan now and go to another job, there are going to be legitimate questions on, were you actually a good coach or were you just a good cheater, right? And even if they're not blackballed in coaching, a lot of other coaching staffs now, however much you value them as a coach, you're probably going to drop them down a couple pegs, because you're going to think their performance was artificially inflated. So yeah, it's a frustrating thing, and I've got the video up right now, the Twitter video on loop, watching the guy with his laminated, pre-prepared sheets standing there on the sideline. I am amazed that Michigan did this as visibly as they did, because it is obvious and it is very illegal. And there was either a lot of hubris or a lot of stupidity involved. Probably a lot of both. Maybe if you're a Michigan fan, rather than trying to fight in your mind the accusation that this was illegal, you need to concede that it was. This was a really bad thing that happened. And the angle you're going to want to start taking, and I'm sure this is what you're saying, Daniel, the coaches are going to start taking is, yeah, this was the new defensive coordinator that came in 2 years ago, and we had this guy, and then he roped the guy into stealing signs for him. And we never really knew how he was reading signs so well. We thought he just was good at picking up tendencies. We didn't realize he was doing all this on the side, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's probably the game that's going to get played, but I can't think it's going to go particularly lovey-dovey within the coaching circles there. But we'll see. I mean, the NCAA's been toothless lately. It's just a very different situation because the other Big Ten schools are pissed beyond belief, as I think you'd imagine, with them scouting at their stadiums. So there's going to be some sort of reprisal here. And I don't know. I do think it also brings awareness to the fact that this is something that can really damage the value of the sport. And this is the thing I'll add one last piece for myself, Daniel. College is particularly vulnerable because of the lack of radios in the helmets. Like Deflategate and the accusations of sign stealing with the New England Patriots were really serious. One, it wasn't completely able to prove what they did, though there are a lot of reports that it was kind of foundation shaking within the NFL, and they kind of had to bury it a little bit for the integrity of the shield. But even there, they can call plays in via radio in the helmet, so the impact was somewhat lessened. You don't have radios in the helmet, which means the impact here in college is really severe. This is something that cannot be allowed to happen because from a competitiveness standpoint, it just breaks the game. It's like paying the referees off to not actually being caught, paying the referees to not ever call a holding call. It's that kind of thing. And so if you're busted with it, it's got to be severe. And, honestly, I think there's going to be a conversation now, especially if they start to break off into super conferences. All those Big Ten and SEC games, they may well put a radio in the helmet. And they may put a rule in. There was a time when that was way too expensive, which is why that rule existed. That technology's gotten a ton cheaper. They may say, hey, you want to play FBS football, you can have a radio in the helmet. And if you can't afford it, that's on you. But it's not a massive expense. So we may see that move down to college to help deal with this issue. But the nature of the college rules does make this a lot more severe, I think, than it would have in the NFL or even maybe something like the MLB where the ability to convey information or the importance of the information is actually somewhat lessened.
All right, y'all, let us know in the comments what you think about this whole situation. And if you are a Michigan fan, we'd love to hear from you too, especially if you've got something to say besides you guys hate Michigan. I think we've done a good job of always treating your team fair, but maybe you feel otherwise. Let us know in the comments what y'all think about this. We'd love to chat with you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.